I encourage you to, because now all the fossils that they find there, they are in the field capturing all these fossils and making every single one of them available online for people to have access to. And we're getting even smaller. A recent tool that we've made available is our molecular visualization tool. Again, this is just free. There is no large model viewer that is capable of doing what this can do and display things at the atomic level. As a matter of fact, at the end of the day, I can tell you that the future of this is simply the front end of design, right? As we move to a world of molecular manufacturing, we will use these kinds of, quote, visualization tools to help us figure out, well, what do we want the thing we are trying to design to actually look like? And then, of course, because they're computable models, we can bring them back out to the real world. We can capture, we can compute, and we can create using these technologies. We've been 3D printing corals and making them available to students in places that will never have access to actually have a piece of coral and look at it and hold it and interact with it. And talk about a visualization, right? That's what that is. Or viruses. So we have a whole bio-nano group now at Autodesk. We've booted our own virus at Pier 9 in San Francisco in our bio-wet lab. But this is a 3D printed model of that virus. And we have incredible insight when you can do a visualization like this, when you can actually hold the thing in your hand at this scale and look at it to better understand it. It changes drastically. We now have design tools that let us simply describe the engineering goals and challenges of something, and the computer does the design for you. Computers are actually quite better at that in some cases. This is a General Electric engine. This is a computer that says, oh, so I need to hold this piece into that engine with all the pressures and things and physics I know about that engine. Okay, here's the piece. And it designed this piece. And this piece was 3D printed, right? All we did was describe what we needed. Think about where this is going to help us with things that we want to send real deep and have serious physics issues that we need to consider as we're sending those things down. So generative design, often sometimes referred to as computational design, something that you should all be paying attention to as well, especially you ocean engineers. You know, these tools are becoming so ubiquitous and so accessible, and I think that's really important for us to all to understand. Things like OpenROV, and by the way, David said, hey, do you think you could take that slide of the OpenROV out, because everybody's mentioning it, but it's important. Tools like OpenROV and other tools are just becoming available to everybody. Look, I can right now, with all you guys in this room, we'll do this and show you quickly. I know now to some of you might think, well, that's not that big a deal, but I have a reason for showing you this. See if it'll work here for us. So for a couple of $100, I can now, for example, attach to my iPhone a infrared thermal imager, right? For just a couple $100, I can walk around, and there you go. Is that a little better? You can see my white hot face, right? So a couple $100 for something that was thousands and thousands of dollars not that long ago. Dominique, who you're going to hear from later, Dominique is going to be taking technologies like this. This is just an iPad mini. It's actually the original, or maybe the second iPad mini. And it's got the Structure I/O scanner on it. And with this technology, I can very easily do fairly sophisticated scans of things. And actually, I could take this, I'll hit the scan button, and it will actually let me just move around a room like this and capture a 3D model of the room. It's, again, a couple $100 for something like this that lets me capture reality. We're definitely moving into this world of capture, compute, create. Visualization doesn't mean what we thought it meant what we thought it meant a long time ago when we talked about computer graphics. Visualization is just a part of this bigger picture, and these tools are available to all of you. So this isn't just the ideas marketplace. These aren't just ideas. These are real things that are happening and people are using and are out there. And if you're not, you are behind the curve, right? Let's face it. So get on board, take a look at some of these things, integrate them into what you're doing, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Is this still on? All right, so I love the Silicon Valley attitude. Get with the program. This is the future. The next speaker is Dominique Rizzolo, and we are moving from tool maker to tool user, and Dominique will tell you about how he's using this type of technology in the field.
Great, thank you, David. We'll actually kind of carry on this conversation that Jonathan started, which I think is fantastic, because it'll show you actually, in some ways, the intrinsic value of recording things in situ and evaluating them in situ. So I guess we'll go to the first slide. I want to make sure that I have this down since we're not auto-advancing. Wonderful. So how do technical divers who are exploring remote and hostile environments bring their discoveries to the surface without removing them? And how do we create digital surrogates of these sites, of these places, for scientists to analyze? And I'd like to use as a case study of sorts the site of Hoyo Negro. It's a near coastal cave on the Yucatan Peninsula. And it's a place where I've had the good fortune of working with a truly tremendous, remarkable group of scientists, engineers, and divers. And my colleagues and I really hope to better understand or learn more about the humans and animal populations that were walking along the coastline of ancient North America, that were venturing into the caves of ancient North America. These are places that are now submerged. And as some of you know, and this has come up in conversations over the past day or so, that there is significant scientific interest in better understanding our now submerged Pleistocene shoreline. Sea levels are up to 100 meters lower at the end of the last glacial maximum. And humans and animals were venturing along coasts and into caves, in our case only to be found by intrepid cave explorers who are bringing these sites to archaeologists and paleontologists, actually a whole range of scientists, to better understand. There was a remarkable discovery in 2007 of a young girl in the bottom of a pit, marine water, 140 feet, in the bottom of this pit known as Hoyo Negro. She is, now we know, the oldest complete set of human remains yet discovered in the Americas. It's a wonderful discovery, but one that presented very real challenges about what do we do now? We've got these bones, a complete skeleton of this individual. How do we bring this to the surface? Well, you can't rush into these kinds of things. So we've been using the techniques that Jonathan mentioned, structure for motion photogrammetry, primarily to record them in their environment. Okay, sometimes that involves moving bones and putting them back into place. But we'll talk a little bit about why we do this, why it's important, especially in archaeology, not to sort of pick things up off the bottom and bring them to the surface and study them in the lab, because it's the relationship between those objects and other natural and cultural features in their environment that will tell us the story of the natural and cultural processes that creates the archaeological record. It's a crime scene, right? And so these kinds of techniques allow us to make the most out of these discoveries. So this is an example of what's possible with SFM photogrammetry. Now, we know that SFM can produce photorealistic models, but what's really important to people studying organisms are models that are geometrically accurate. We can make the kinds of measurements that can tell us something, in this case, about who this individual is. What old world populations does she represent? What can we learn about her craniofacial morphology that links us back to the first peoples that came into the Americas? How is she different or similar to other populations? Well, we were able to then also, again, doing all of this work in the cave using SFM photogrammetry to produce a facial reconstruction of this individual. Was published in the January issue of National Geographic magazine. So from remote to sort of tangible, through the use or adoption of these techniques. And again, this is a case study. This can be applied to any number of underwater sites. But it's the challenge of, in many ways, of getting these tools and these individuals into the water. We have an entire assemblage of extinct Pleistocene megafauna, from gomphotheres or extinct elephants to giant ground sloths, smilodons in this case, saber-toothed cats, the whole faunal assemblage of ancient Mexico in marine water, right? The bottom of a cave near the coast of Yucatan. So these kinds of sites are particularly challenging. We're taking a site-level approach to photogrammetry. Now, these are the kinds of places, and I've been working with autonomous vehicles and ROVs for some time, and realizing now that that sometimes you just got to send a person, right? Dealing with tether management issues and telemetry, that sometimes you got to put these tools in the hands of divers who can bring them down to the bottom and basically come up with the kind of methodology and workflow to do a complete reality capture of a space like this, a place that we want to bring topside for scientists to work on. So one of the things that we're really focusing on now with this kind of photogrammetric technique is actually how to make those point clouds annotatable, how to have people in real time around the world be able to make measurements and work with extraordinarily dense point clouds, in this case an area about 1 meter by 1.5 meter of almost 1 billion XYZ coordinates. This is a scale that we're not typically used to with SFM. How do we remove the substrate in the case of this slide here, where now we can look at the different elements of the human skeleton, understand the nature of articulation and disarticulation that is indicative of certain site formation processes. We can do that now through the kinds of techniques that allow us to manipulate the context of those objects that we're interested in using SFM, using software both off the shelf and custom development by students and engineers that we're working with as well. We want to, again, models that are visually photorealistic, but also geometrically accurate for measurements, but also to look at the kinds of information that really our eyes can provide, in this case, diagenetic processes that are marked by certain kinds of colors in the benthic environment. We need all different kinds of information. These tools are making it possible. And we're doing all of this, again, in situ, right? These bones have not come out of the cave yet. And I'll close with this because I think this is particularly powerful. We talk a lot about these sort of individual experience as far as VR goes, putting these headsets on and sort of looking around you, and it's very powerful in terms of getting things, controlling things in the water. But one of the things that we really love at UCSD, where I work, are the kinds of visualization, 3D environments that allow you to have a conversation about your data. You get your colleagues around you, and you stand up there, and the gears start turning differently in your head as you're immersed in this environment with your colleagues, right? So it's not an individual experience. It's this kind of collaborative analysis that we can do with these point clouds, with these SFM models, using these kinds of environments. And we're starting to take those environments on the road, portable and road cases, all in 3D, building in an augmented reality component that allows you to take these benthic environments, take these sites wherever they are, in seas, lakes, and rivers, to people to have these kinds of conversations. And really that's where, I think that's where the ideas come from, is when we work together as a group in front of these data in this sort of visualization environment. So I'll leave you with that. Explore, enjoy the rest of the meeting, and thank you for the opportunity to share this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominique. I think the last few speakers do a really good job of showing what's possible with all this new computational power. I mean, we're really living in this world where we're living in Gordon Moore's kind of dream that he had 4 decades ago, where he saw computers getting cheaper, better, smaller, faster every couple of years. It's opened up a lot of possibilities and has really transformed how we live our lives. Now, biotechnology is moving faster than Moore's law. The cost of DNA sequencing, the advent of CRISPR-Cas9, gene editing, biotechnology is moving really quick. And it's going to transform our lives in similar ways. And I can only imagine that this is going to affect how we understand our oceans. Just yesterday, the FDA approved the first genetically engineered salmon. I know scientists in Hawaii are working on genetically modified coral. It's going to get weird, and part of that field is eDNA, and here to talk about that is Jimmy O'Donnell.
Some clickers up here. Thanks, David. Let's see. Middle button, there we go. Okay, so on the left here is a dating website, and on the right is a purse seine. And the question struck me recently, can we distinguish our approach to managing marine resources from our approaches to dating? There's plenty more fish in the sea. And I think for most industrialized societies until relatively recently, the answer might be something close to no. But as the demand for marine resources grows, we're going to be faced with more specific questions like how many fish are there in the sea and where are those fish? We don't know the answers to those questions yet because the ocean is gigantic and dark and fish are hard to count there. And pretty much if we want to know something about a place in the ocean, we drive there, we drag a net around, or we put some cameras down, and we have somebody help us, a taxonomic expert, sort through all the stuff we get. As we heard yesterday, I love this phrase, the ocean is zesty. So expeditions out there are expensive and can be dangerous. We're limited by the taxonomic expertise of the people we can bring with us or to whom we can get the data once we're back home. And these things are reflected in this map of our knowledge of species in the ocean. So it's sparse both with respect to taxonomy and spatially. And I think if we're going to address those white spots on the map where we have no data, we can't continue under this current paradigm, under our current approach. We're going to need, research funding is not going to get any easier to come by, and the places we need to access are not going to be easier to get to. So we need approaches that are both scalable and automatable. And a technique with exactly those properties is to survey a biological community by sequencing the DNA that it leaves behind in the environment. And this is possible by virtue of the fact that all organisms shed DNA into their environment, be that soil, air, water. We can take that environment, we can concentrate the biological material there. That's scientific jargon for filter it. We extract DNA from that filter and we sequence all the DNA we get. We can then assign that to some taxon or population that we think we might have identified. I like to think of this a little bit like making yourself a pour-over, sequencing the filter, and then saying, did Ethan Hawke drink out of this? If you haven't seen this movie I'm referring to, Gattaca, you have to watch it tonight. And so some colleagues and I, led by Jesse Port at Stanford and Ryan Kelly at the University of Washington, tried this approach alongside the gold standard of fish counting in shallow water. We sent out some divers, they counted fish, they scooped up Nalgene bottles of water, and then we sequenced it, and we got some interesting results. We found kelpfish and rockfish in the kelp forest, and we found surf perch and seabird DNA in the seagrass. But what I really loved was the parts of the results that don't line up. When you get no record of flatfish in the sand flats from divers, and yet you pick up their DNA in your samples. You get shy stuff like sea otters in the kelp forest that are scared of divers. In a similar project we've been working on with some colleagues at NOAA, Jamil Samori, Oli Shelton, and Linda Park, we've surveyed eelgrass communities around Puget Sound, and we do that by dragging a net along, scooping up all the little critters that are on the blades of eelgrass, and then sorting through them. And in those samples, you get exactly what you expect: crab, shrimp, slow fish. And when we got our DNA results back, we were a little bit puzzled by the fact that we got almost none of that stuff. We got orders of magnitude greater taxonomic coverage, so lots of species, but we got mostly the stuff that was down below the sediment, all the clams, the sea cucumbers, the worms, that are no less important to maintaining that functional ecosystem, but are just not things that we're normally looking for. And I love that about eDNA, that forced, broader perspective that says, you know, you've always been looking at this part of the community, but this is all the stuff that's really there. And I'm excited about the role of eDNA in ocean research because it's exactly that broad perspective you would want if you had one shot at surveying a biological community in a place that you had never explored before. And as we've heard repeatedly, technology is already there. Data, we're going to have more data than we know what to do with. We almost already do. And so I think one of the biggest challenges as sequencing technology gets cheaper, faster, more portable, is training the next generation of ocean explorers in the skills that we need to translate the data into information and to move from there's plenty more fish in the sea to how many fish are there in the sea. Thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy. So the last two speakers are both from NASA. I think one of the things I've learned, kind of getting roped into this community over the past few years, is that this comes up a lot, the NASA comparison. People always say, well, how come NASA has so much money? How come NASA is so good at doing publicity? Why don't we have as much money for ocean exploration? And I think the way that this gets phrased might not be right. Maybe it shouldn't be either or, maybe it should be and that's the message that Darlene Lim has been talking about for a long time, and here she is. Mic and the clicker.
Okay, and I bring my water up.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Okay. So let's see if I can move this forward and be a good representative of NASA with my technical savvy. Okay, so as David mentioned, my name is Darlene Lim. I'm based at the NASA Ames Research Center. I'm a research scientist. And I've been conducting field science for over 20 years. What I'm here to talk to you about today are some shared collective themes that I've identified, on my journey as a field scientist over the last few years. And I think last night, Ellen, as many of you heard, gave a really great overview of the collective shared themes between whether it's exploration on land, on the ocean, or in space. And she showed you some of the manifestations of those collective exploration endeavors at an agency level. And what I'm here to present to you today is a grassroots perspective of those shared themes. So I'm going to move forward a slide here. And when we go about writing proposals or putting together our missions when we go into the field, we tend to follow a set of guidelines. And these range from, I can't really see because my eyesight is terrible, but there's the science, there's the science operations, as well as the technology. And under each one of these themes, I've listed a bunch of questions, a bunch of different types of issues that come up as we start to put our missions together that I think have direct relevance to what we've been talking about over the last day and a half, which is trying to identify mechanisms and new approaches in the way that we conduct exploration collectively. And so to sort of draw from a mission statement that we invoke a lot at NASA, which is that science enables exploration and exploration enables science, I've put up that ocean exploration can enable space exploration, and space exploration can enable ocean exploration. And let me talk to you a bit about that some more. So under the science, there are questions that are relevant to astrobiology that we can only ask, or that we can ask in ways that require us to go into our oceans and eventually then extract from that data that we collect in our oceans to understanding other water worlds that Ellen spoke to you about last night. In terms of science operations, now in my recent dealings with many people that are experts at going to sea, it is incredible for me to observe the type of setup, the decision-making protocols, the incredible amount of discipline that goes into putting together a mission console to manage through a mission under telepresence, as an example. That type of operational knowledge sometimes doesn't get articulated. It certainly doesn't get written down. It just happens. But in it are incredible amounts of nuggets for us to understand how to better configure ourselves when we conduct exploration for science, whether it's here on the Earth or elsewhere on other planets. The last thing is technology. There has been discussion about in situ measurements, the type of technology that we require to detect life, as an example. What about the type of requirements that come into play when managing the data? Getting ourselves outside of the data morgue that Mary Wojtek mentioned yesterday and trying to disseminate that information in a way that taps into the community of citizen science scientists, that taps into the distributed science teams that we're going to have to necessitate because we can't bring everyone to sea, we can't bring everyone into space, but people want to engage the scientists in a meaningful way. So all of these questions are very much shared, and I think these themes can bind us as we move forward and start to look at how do we actually manage the limited resources that we have in all spectrums of exploration science. Some of the preparing for human exploration that happens at NASA involves what are called analogs, we go into different field science environments, a lot of times we're working underwater, and we will conduct what are called either engineering analogs or else science-driven analogs. So at NASA, as an example, at NEMO, which is based at the Aquarium underwater base in the Florida Keys, we have a mission there which is heavily geared at testing protocols as well as hardware aimed at deep space human exploration. So they will go in and look at different grappling techniques under the the buoyancy that is conferred to you when you're underwater, which is analogous to conducting research in space. And they'll go in and they'll test their different concepts as well as their hardware, and then from there drive out what are the requirements, what are the best practices that they've seen as a consequence of these tests. They also do this on land in a variety of different ways and as well in the lab. So where people like myself come in is we are field scientists, and we will put together what are called science-driven analogs. So at the foundation of all of our field missions is science. We go in with real scientific questions. We go in with graduate students that have to graduate, with postdocs that are trying to build a career by publication. And from there, we'll absorb the different exploration concepts, the different technologies that have been devised by these engineering-heavy analog missions, and test them in a way in this real science environment. And so it's a truth test. It's like an engineer can think up all sorts of really cool things and test them in a way which is necessary for them to look at the different systematics involved with what they designed. But then when we absorb it into our crazy cat-like world of scientists that, are very rarely able to articulate things quickly, but have to cogitate on them and then use them in a way which sometimes is, use technology in a way which is sometimes beyond what we are used to in a field science way, you start to drive out what works, what doesn't work. What are the user design elements that are required and what are not? And so we think that this is really important because what it allows us to do is essentially look at the value add components of a mission and what are those that don't add value, and that takes advantage, or that really helps manage the limited resources that NASA has, for example, in getting us ready to explore in deep space with humans. So from a field scientist, perspective around what is truly important and what we're trying to drive at with these science-driven analogs is essentially we try and guide all our missions with 4 different principles. Number 1, safety. We have to keep our scientists alive because a dead scientist is really a useless scientist. I think anybody that's been to sea can say the same thing. You want to keep everyone alive. The other thing that we use as a guideline when we go out there, which I think, once again, all 4 of these have direct relevance, they're already being invoked by you all who go to sea, is that we try and protect the environment that we're studying. If we're trying to detect life, if we're trying to sample in a clean, sterile way, it is really useless for us to go around and cough and sneeze all over the environment that we're doing. It's also not so good if we're destructive when we go out there. So we try and design our operations to limit that as much as possible. The other thing is then after that we have, we want to go out there and be as productive as possible in our science. We want to be able to go out and test the hypotheses that are guiding us. And then, as we heard yesterday, there's sort of this gradient of research that occurs from the hypothesis-driven to somewhere in between to the real exploration-based science. And so the last thing is we want to be able to enable ourselves in these missions to explore, to make discoveries. And as we go about all of these, basically following these guidelines and absorbing a lot of the operational concepts that I said have been generated through these other analog missions, we're able to drive out the concepts of operations and the capabilities that enable and enhance scientific return. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different projects as an example of this type of science-driven mission that I think share a lot of the different themes that have been discussed over the last little while and that have driven out some solutions to issues that have been discussed over the last day and a half as kind of commonalities between our exploration regimes. So one is the Pavilion Lake Research Project, the other is Basalt. Pavilion Lake has just finished up its last field mission this summer and has 1 more year of funding. Basalt just started up. And then I'm going to talk to you about Subsea, which is a proposal that just went into a NASA funding stream, which was written actually with Chris German as well as Brian Kennedy and in association with, a lot of support from the OER. And so what binds all 3 of these particular field mission projects, and they can involve anywhere from from 20 to upwards of 80 people. And in the case of Pavilion Lake, I think we cycled through almost 350 people through that project over the last decade. Is that all three are bound by science. And so as an example, in the case of Pavilion Lake, we were working in a lake in Western Canada that was deep, by some of the local lake standards anyways. It went down to about 200 feet, and it's almost 6 kilometers long. And so we were interrogating this lake with a variety of different assets. They ranged from ROVs to AUVs, single-person submersibles, and then in our third phase of research, we used scuba divers supported by ROV assets in order to give the science team some sort of eyes on the scene as they went about their research. We were at this lake to investigate the mechanisms by which the microbialites, which are populated throughout this lake, were built. So microbialites are rocks, the "ite" part of the word, built by microbes, the front end of the word. And these have incredible relevance to us in understanding early Earth systems. So in the next project that I just spoke to you about, basalt, this is a land-based project, but again, very similar exploration questions that we're asking here, but very different scientific question. So in this case, we're looking at the alteration chemistry, geochemistry that is associated with active volcanic sites, and in this case we're working in the flanks of Kilauea, as well as extinct volcanic sites, and in that case there's a field site in Idaho that we're working at. And we're looking at the association of biology, of microbial life, with those different geochemistries, and then trying to extrapolate that knowledge to Mars and our understanding of that, of the habitability of that planet. The third project that I mentioned has just been submitted as a proposal, is meant to look at water-rock interactions on our Earth's ocean, deep in the Earth ocean, about 6,000 meters down, in order to look at chemical disequilibria and to understand the processes that may generate life in those kind of conditions. Now, what also binds these projects is that we're crazy. So as all of you know who go out and do field science, it's already hard enough when you just do it with, on your own and you're dealing with the elements and so forth. Well, we try and make our lives a living hell, and so what we do is we have a science backroom team. We've got people that are out in the field acting as our astronauts on EVA, extravehicular activity, and then we delay the communication between those that are out in the field and those that are sitting in the science backroom team in order to mimic the conditions of having astronauts doing science on Mars. So there is an inherent delay when one would go out and do science in deep space, anywhere from 4 minutes to 20 minutes one way when you're doing operations on Mars. So we actually invoke that during our missions. The slide that you're seeing here shows you the communication system that we set into place at Pavilion Lake. This is sort of similar when we get on land and in any other circumstance. You see a deep worker submersible there. We were transmitting telemetry, imagery, as well as voice in a full duplex or two-way manner. And what we did here is that was transmitted from the sub up to a surface vessel that was chasing us. We were tethered by a fiber optic cable. And then that information was then transmitted back to a remote science team that was sitting in a mission control trailer. But that information was translated back with an inherent 50-second delay. In this case at Pavilion, we were working on an asteroid mission concept. And so what that does is it dramatically changes the operation, the kind of support network that we have in place when there's real-time comms has to change and adapt to the fact that now you almost have to be more concise, more precise with your transmission of data. And what came out of this is that something that we needed to support us, and which has really evolved and come out of the Pavilion Lake Research Project, but which has since been absorbed by many different projects, whether robotic or human exploration based, is something called the Exploration Ground Data System. This is a software which is actually, it's web-based, so anybody can log on from anywhere in the world, and I will stress this again in the next few slides. But this is a piece of software, a capability that came out by this real science-driven exploration mission. And it allows us to plan, it allows us to plan our missions, to monitor our missions in real time, as well as to explore the data after the fact so that we can really generate some solid papers coming out of this information. Once again, it's a web-based planning tool in its kind of first, step of what it provides. And so what we're able to do is ingest different maps, whether it's bathymetry, it's topography, whatever it may be, and from there plan our missions. It's going to be even more kind of tricked out once we start moving into basalt, when we start generating layers that include some of the human factors that we're looking at as well. This system allows us to do live monitoring, live note-taking. So you can be sitting in the science backroom team, you can be sitting anywhere in the world and be monitoring our mission and taking notes. Those notes from, say, 50 different scientists are all getting input and time-stamped and coordinated with a moment in a video. We had multiple streams, so we had still cameras, video cameras, and all of that is coordinated and visualized through XGDS. And you're also able to see where your asset or your assets are at any given point in time. After the fact, as I mentioned, to explore the data, we're able to go through in XGDS and actually look at the timeline of notes and the images that were captured along that. So in this case, we only had one set of video coming back from Deep Worker. In the case that we're working on now, we have multiple streams of information that are coming back, and all of it gets, you can look at it again through this note-taking mechanism where you can see anybody's information at that point in time. So just to back up a second, where this stemmed from was discussions between the scientists and the engineers saying, one of our main issues coming back from the field is the fact that we need to see things rapidly in the field and definitely thereafter. But everybody takes their own notes, and we have a hell of a time putting that all together in a meaningful way. You need a lot of monkeys to do that, and a lot of time we don't have those monkeys to transcribe those notes. So this gets around that issue very rapidly. And the fact that it's been used in multiple different field sites in many different circumstances, and the fact that we've heard that data dissemination or synthesis is an incredibly important, necessary component of actually going out to sea, doing any sort of exploration whatsoever. This is the reason why this team is actually working on open sourcing this XGDS capability so that other users can come in. They want a sample size of more than just NASA for the use case of this particular capability. So going forward, I've just given you an example of kind of a NASA-based project and the capability we've driven out of that I think can be pushed forward as a solution to some of the common issues that we deal with between the field science we do at NASA and then what we've heard about and seen and what you all experience through the ocean exploration. I think similarly there's another partnership that can happen the other way, which is a big part of our proposal, and that is that when we looked at the telepresence format, whether it's on the Okeanos or the Nautilus, this is an incredible opportunity for us to look at, say, putting the XGDS system in a situation whereby you really do have a very distributed science backroom team, which we've never done before. We've distributed only in a couple of different nodes, but not across time zones that is the case in all of the missions when they go out to sea. We also have not run XGDS for like over 100 days. We usually go out into the field for 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, but in your case, you're going out for over 100 days at a time. That's an incredible opportunity for us to break the system, to see what happens when you start to use something for that long. What are the other requirements that get jammed out of that kind of situation? The other thing is that we're hoping that we can utilize this telepresence model as a way to look at the best practices that you all undertake when you go to sea under those circumstances. We're also hoping to actually do some of that communications latency testing on this type of telepresence model so we can start to understand what it might be like to do low latency teleoperations on Mars. This is a mission concept which is part of the Evolvable Mars campaign, which is part of the journey to Mars, where it's a phased campaign to get to Mars, and part of that phasing would involve potentially putting human astronauts on the surface of Phobos or Deimos and having them operate assets on the surface of Mars, robotic assets, because there's much less of a latency there, so you can potentially get higher sort of situational awareness and a much deeper understanding of your environment if that latency is shortened. So this telepresence model is a wonderful opportunity for us to once again compare and share best practices, solve issues together, and so forth. So this last slide here, I meant to read off it. I'm actually going to move so I can. It's sort of my summary about the reason for the marketplace. We were asked to talk about the approaches that could be game-changing in ocean exploration. And so for me, I don't have a technology to offer you, but what I do have are some statements about a coordinated approach. Because I think that this will not only change the way that ocean exploration is perhaps enabled, but it will also change the way that we sculpt our mission architectures for human exploration of space. The other thing is that I think we should spend time as a coordinated community sharing which knowledge gaps we have, whether they be science operations, or technology, as I mentioned, those shared sort of themes. And I'm sure there are many other shared themes that we can hone in on. We should also be looking at how these issues have already been addressed and how have they been solved, and then how can they actually suit each other's specific custom requirements. And I think that it's at these convergence points that we're going to have these oohs and these ahs and these complete moments of inspiration. It already happens on a small scale during our missions, and I think there is lots of opportunity there to explore between the ocean and the space exploration communities. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Darlene. I don't think there's any project that has done a better job of potentially bridging this gap between ocean exploration and science exploration than the Europa mission. I think it sparked a lot of people's imagination, and a lot of people are excited about it. And we're really lucky to have Kevin Hand here from NASA, who's going to talk about that.
Thank you, David. Great. Thank you, and thank you to David and Alan and others for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today. Technically, I am not with NASA. I'm with JPL. We are an FFRDC of NASA, which means I am an employee of Caltech, and I beg headquarters for money. Are the slides? Yeah, great. Thank you. And part of what I'll talk about is a bridge that does exist already, but a bridge that I hope we can build in much greater capacity in the years to come with regard to robotic exploration of our ocean and eventually the robotic exploration of oceans beyond Earth. There we go. So for much of human history, we really have been a species that has sought out new lands, new continents, new rocks, new places to plant flags. And it's my hope and my expectation that 100 years from now, when we look back at our century, we will see our century as a new age of ocean exploration. An age of ocean exploration that brings us to the deepest depths of our ocean and maps the bottom of our ocean at whatever scale it is Bob Ballard is now wanting it to be at. And it's also an age of ocean exploration that will bring us to these ocean worlds beyond Earth. And with regard to the exploration on our home planet, it will be motivated by a desire to better understand our biosphere, to better understand our climate, and to better understand resources in the depths of our ocean. When it comes to the exploration of these worlds beyond Earth, it will be motivated by a desire to find signs of life out there in our solar system. And the story of our search for life elsewhere is the story of this beautiful blue marble reaching out into the solar system, looking for signs of life beyond Earth. What you're seeing here, each of these lines emanating from our planet represents a robotic vehicle that has gone out to the moon, to Venus, to Mars. And you see just a few lines going out to the outer solar system. These are the lines that correspond to the Voyager, the Galileo, and the Cassini spacecraft. And one of the lesser appreciated discoveries of planetary science over the past few decades is that as a result of the data returned from these spacecraft, we now know that ocean worlds exist out there in our outer solar system. This is what I like to refer to as sort of a portrait of ocean worlds of our solar system. At the center, of course, is the Earth, which has the ocean we know and love. And around the Earth, I have placed 6 moons of the outer solar system. These are moons like Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, 3 ice-covered moons of Jupiter. Titan and Enceladus, 2 ice-covered moons of Saturn. Titan actually has a nice atmosphere, too. And it may even be that Neptune's curious little moon, Triton, also harbors a liquid water subsurface ocean mixed with some ammonia. These are worlds that are covered in ice, but beneath their icy shells, we think they have potentially global liquid water oceans. And the way in which these oceans exist actually is sort of a new Goldilocks for habitability. In the early days of solar system exploration and understanding what it takes for a planet to be habitable, we thought you had to be just the right distance from your parent star, so you had enough energy to maintain a liquid water ocean on the surface in contact with a nice atmosphere. The way in which many of these oceans are being maintained is through that tidal tug and pull as worlds like Europa go around Jupiter, which is some 318 times as massive as the Earth. So that tidal tug and pull creates that mechanical energy, which results in friction, which ultimately results in some heat that we think keeps that ocean liquid water. And of course, from an astrobiological perspective, part of what excites us about these ocean worlds of the outer solar system is that if we've learned anything from life on Earth, it's that in general, where you find the liquid water, you find life, whether it's the deep sea hydrothermal vents, the transantarctic mountains, or hot springs in the Rift Valley, whether it's life in extreme environments or life of extreme lifestyles. All life on Earth requires liquid water. And I like to show this slide for another reason, speaking of water, and that is that for all of the diversity of life on Earth, for all of the beautiful differences we see in our own biosphere, we're really not that different. From the most bizarre of deep sea microbe to the craziest of rock star, we're all built and operated with the same fundamental biochemical paradigm, the DNA, RNA, protein, and even ATP paradigm. Part of what motivates my interest in the search for life elsewhere is to find living life, life that is alive today, that would allow us to probe this question of, is DNA, RNA, and protein the only game in town? Is there another way to get the business of life done? Are there other trees of life out there? All life on Earth is connected by that same fundamental tree. Is there another tree? These ocean worlds of the outer solar system provide the locales to go and look for new trees of life, to look for a second origin of life, to look for a second genesis in our own backyard, because these liquid water environments are there today, and we think they've been there for much of the history of the solar system. I'll just briefly go into Europa, and then I'll move to Enceladus, and then I'll close with a few connections back to Earth. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Europa. We do have a mission on the books to go and fly by Europa to investigate its surface and subsurface. Our current understanding of Europa is the following. We think it's got an ice shell that's maybe a few to as many as 20 kilometers in thickness. It's a huge debate within the community. I actually fall into what's called the thin shell camp, and then there's the thick shell camp. And so I think it's closer to maybe 5 kilometers in thickness. Beneath that icy shell, our current best understanding is that there is a 100-kilometer deep global liquid water ocean, and beneath that is a rocky seafloor. And part of what makes this environment attractive, both to the origin of life and to the habitability of the ocean in general, is that we think there's chemical cycling potentially between the ocean water and seafloor, and possibly also between the ice shell and the ocean. And we think the ice shell may serve as a window into the ocean below. Here's Enceladus, a much smaller moon. It's only 500 kilometers in diameter. Europa is about 3,000 kilometers in diameter, about the size of our own moon. Enceladus is a bizarre little world that, at first appearances, looks old. The ice in the north has all these craters, and that, to a planetary scientist, means it's an old surface. But when you zoom in on the south polar terrain, you see these 4 fractures. And I hope that many of you have seen these images. You saw a couple of them last night with Ellen's presentation. But we now know that those fractures in Enceladus' south polar terrain are allowing oceanic water to come up and erupt out of these fractures. The Cassini spacecraft has flown just recently to 30 miles above the surface of Enceladus. If we could take a a picture of the spacecraft as it flies by. It would be in this frame. And so the mass spectrometers on board have tasted this ocean water and found not only liquid water and methane and CO2 and some simple organics, but they've also found salts indicative of a water-rock interaction and SiO2, silica. And the best explanation for that silica is low temperature hydrothermalism, akin to sort of lost city type of serpentinization, 70 degrees C or so. So this is our current cross-section, and in fact, this, even though this cartoon was created just about 9 months ago, it's actually now out of date. This cartoon shows a south polar ocean with fractures leading up to those plumes. We now think that Enceladus's ocean is global. We think it goes all the way around. And that ice shell is maybe 40 kilometers in thickness. So what is the bridge? What is the opportunity here? Well, as Ellen explained last night, NASA is engaged in a lot of earth science, but most of the oceanic earth science goes from the surface of our ocean upwards. I think, as do many of my colleagues, that the technological and scientific questions that we're bringing to bear on worlds like Europa and Enceladus offer a real opportunity for NASA to now dive deep, to use some of our technological capabilities to explore our ocean as a bridge to the exploration of these ocean worlds beyond Earth. And the science, when it comes to Europa and Enceladus, really is about revolutionizing biology. But importantly, even in the absence of biology on these worlds, we will still be able to do comparative oceanography. On the technological side, I can't read the full bullets there. I'll leave it to you to read those. But there are a lot of things that are converging at the NASA level that, that make some of these big missions possible, not the least of which is new launch vehicles and a need to start testing out some of these robotic capabilities that, that would someday be used on the surface and in the subsurface of Europa and Enceladus. And just to kind of give you a sense of scale of how Europa's ocean and Enceladus's ocean compare to our ocean, even though these oceans are trapped beneath many kilometers of ice, we're really not talking about that harsh of an ocean environment if you could magically transport yourself through the ice shell. The hard part is getting there and through the ice. But as you can see from this slide, the comparative pressure depth on Europa is, so if you go all the way down to the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench, you are about 80 kilometers equivalent within Europa. Now that's not Europa's seafloor, but that is very far down in Europa. And at Enceladus, you're at about 1/10 of a meter per second squared acceleration, and so there you're talking about an equivalent depth of only 1 kilometer here on Earth. And of course, we've got human vehicles that can tolerate those depths. So, moral of the story is, if you could magically transport Alvin to Europa, it would do okay. We don't quite know the salinity and the sulfuric acid content of Europa's ocean, but you know, it's a little detail. So where are we going? Well, I'll start with the end, the dream of dreams, and then I'll back to Earth and tell you a little bit about some of the robotic vehicles that my team has been developing. In our dream of dreams, and I should mention this is not a NASA video, this is a Hollywood video, so there was a comment about Ellen's great videos. The only people that can top NASA videos are the Hollywood folks. So in this incarnation, we land on the surface of Europa, we deploy a melt probe, which uses a heat source of some sort to get all the way through the ice, leaving behind a communication tether to the base station on the surface. Once we reach the ice-water interface, we then release that nose cone and deploy an autonomous underwater vehicle. In this scenario, of course, we're 5.2 AU, 5.2 times as distance from the Earth as the Earth is from the Sun. And so this is going to have a lot of artificial intelligence. We're not going to be able to joystick it. It eventually finds its way down to the hydrothermal vents on Europa's seafloor. And in this Hollywood version, we then make contact with charismatic macrofauna and change biology forever. So that is sort of the dream of dreams, but where do we begin? We have to start somewhere, and my team, we got some seed funding from Mary's office to build a robotic vehicle that allows us to explore these ice-covered lakes and some of the sea ice in Alaska. And the sort of aha moment here was quite interesting. Being at JPL as a scientist, I get to work with these brilliant engineers who build things like the Mars rovers. And we were out on the ice studying these methane-seeping lakes a number of years ago. And I wanted a vehicle that could map these out, just mow the lawns, find all the methane. But as you all appreciate, submersibles are very energy intensive. To have thrusters and move around and do station keeping is a pain in the neck. Well, these are shallow lakes, and really what I was interested in is the methane trapped in the ice and the ice-water interface, and that allowed us to say, well, why swim? Why not just rove? Why not have a buoyant rover that sticks to the underside of the ice, and when it stops, and when it goes, it goes. And so that's what this video will show you, some of our under ice, our buoyant rover for under ice exploration, or BRUI as we call it, and I'll just let this play. So this has got sound. Can you turn it up a bit? The rover that our team has developed is an early precursor of something that we may someday fly to Europa. The buoyant rover for under ice exploration is designed to float on the underside of the ice and rove as if the underside of the ice is the ground. These ecosystems up in Alaska, these lakes that freeze over every year and freeze down, they're just one example of life in an extreme environment that can help guide us in assessing whether or not a world like Europa could harbor life. We cut a hole in the ice, put the rover underneath the ice, and then left it out there to rove around. And we went back to the nice warm Quonset hut, and our team was even able to hand over control to engineers down in JPL. And so we think this truly was the first time ever that an underwater, under ice, untethered vehicle has been operated through satellite link. Our work has this wonderful marriage of advancing our understanding of what's happening on our own planet while simultaneously feeding forward into our exploration of potentially habitable worlds beyond Earth. So I'll leave it there, and yes, that was going up to 900 megahertz through the ice, up to an Iridium station, back down to JPL, and then back. Thank you very much.
Wow. Let's do that. That's the show. Thank you guys so much for sticking with it, and for all the speakers who all did a really good job. I hope that something you heard piqued your imagination and have you maybe thinking in a slightly different way. We are almost perfectly on time and ready for lunch. Thanks. Oh, sorry.